At 20:45 on October 5, 1863, Lieutenant William Glassell crouched in the cramped forward compartment of the CSS David, peering through the narrow viewing port at the dark waters of Charleston Harbor. 29 feet of iron-plated wood separated him from the most powerful warship in the Union blockade fleet. His fingers gripped the torpedo spar release mechanism. In 3 minutes, he would either change naval warfare forever or die trying. The USS New Ironsides sat anchored 400 yards ahead, her 3,486-ton bulk silhouetted against the distant fires of Charleston. The ironclad mounted 20 11-inch Dahlgren smoothbore cannons, each capable of firing a 136-pound shell every 90 seconds. Her 4.5-inch armor plating had deflected Confederate artillery for months. She was considered unsinkable, invincible, the cornerstone of the blockade that was strangling the Confederacy. Glassell's vessel was something the world had never seen before. Not quite a submarine, not quite a surface ship. The CSS David rode so low in the water that only her smokestack, a small hatch, and the cigar-shaped curve of her upper hull broke the surface. From 100 yards away in darkness, she was nearly invisible, 50 feet long, 5 feet wide at the beam. A single-cylinder steam engine producing just 6 horsepower. Top speed 7 knots, barely faster than a man could row. But at her bow, extending 14 feet forward on an iron spar, hung a copper cylinder packed with 134 pounds of black powder. A contact fuse. One good strike below the waterline, and the unsinkable ironclad would learn what Confederate desperation could engineer. The idea had come from Theodore Stoney, a Charleston mechanic and engineer, earlier that year. While Union ironclads pounded Fort Sumter into rubble and tightened their grip on Charleston Harbor, Stoney sketched designs in lamplight. A vessel designed around a single principle: invisibility through minimalism. Strip away everything unnecessary. Build something so low profile it could approach under the cover of darkness undetected. David Theodore's boiler works had constructed the hull in 6 weeks. Iron plating over pine frames, ballast tanks for trimming the waterline, a modified locomotive boiler generating steam at 80 psi. The crew compartment measured 6 feet long, barely enough room for 4 men to crouch. No bunks, no galley, no provisions beyond what could fit in their pockets. This wasn't a ship designed for comfort or extended operations. It was a delivery system for 134 pounds of explosives. They'd named her David, as in David and Goliath. The symbolism wasn't subtle, but it was accurate. Glassell had volunteered for command knowing the odds. Previous experiments with submarine warfare had been catastrophic. The CSS Hunley had already killed 13 men during training exercises. Crews suffocated, drowned when ballast tanks flooded, died when the experimental vessels simply failed to resurface. But the Hunley was fully submersible, requiring hand-cranked propulsion underwater. The David was different. She stayed on the surface, using steam power, maintaining an air supply. Theoretically survivable. Still, no one knew what would happen when the torpedo detonated. Would the blast radius kill the crew? Would the concussion sink the David herself? Would Union sentries spot them before they could close the distance? Assistant Engineer J.W. Cannon monitored the steam pressure gauge. 75 psi and climbing. Fireman James Sullivan fed coal into the boiler, keeping the flames hot enough to maintain power but small enough to avoid throwing sparks from the stack. Pilot W.T. Toombs held the rudder steady, maintaining their heading directly toward the New Ironside's starboard quarter. No moon. Heavy cloud cover obscured the stars. Perfect conditions. The Union blockade had evolved into a massive operation. 65 warships formed a steel ring around Charleston Harbor, enforcing a stranglehold that had cut Confederate supply lines to near zero. Before the war, Charleston had been one of the South's busiest ports. Now, only the fastest blockade runners dared attempt entry, and most of those ended up captured or sunk. The economic impact was devastating. No medicine, no ammunition, no replacement parts for machinery. The Confederacy was bleeding out, and Charleston was the wound. The New Ironsides had arrived in January, immediately becoming the blockade's centerpiece. She'd survived everything the Confederates had thrown at her. Artillery from Fort Sumter had bounced off her armor. Floating mines had detonated harmlessly against her reinforced hull. She seemed invincible because, by every conventional measure, she was. Conventional warfare, however, was about to end. Glassell raised his hand. The David's engine cut to idle. They drifted forward on momentum, completely silent now except for the gentle lap of water against the hull. 200 yards. The ironclad's deck lanterns were visible now, casting yellow pools of light across her wooden deck. Sentries patrolled in pairs. No alarm had been raised. 150 yards. Glassell could make out individual sailors moving about the deck. Someone laughed. The sound carried clearly across the water. They had no idea death was approaching at 7 knots through darkness. At 100 yards, a Union lookout spotted them. A shout cut through the night. "Boat ahoy! Identify yourself!" Glassell didn't respond. The David surged forward as cannon opened the throttle fully. The steam engine roared. White water churned behind them. Sailors scrambled across the new Ironside's deck. Someone rang the alarm bell. Orders were shouted. Rifles appeared along the railing. Musket fire erupted. Muzzle flashes lit up the ironclad's deck like lightning. Bullets pinged off the David's iron plating, ricocheting into the water with sharp whines. A round punched through the smokestack, sending sparks spinning into the night. Another shattered the viewing port glass. Glassell ducked instinctively, pressing himself against the hull. 75 yards. The spar torpedo was below the waterline now, invisible to the Union gunners. They kept firing at the David herself, not realizing the real threat was extending 14 feet ahead of the vessel they could barely see. 50 yards. Glassell could smell the coal smoke from the new Ironside's own boilers. Could hear boots pounding on the wooden deck above. Someone was screaming to bring the Dahlgrens to bear, but those massive cannons couldn't depress low enough to target something riding at waterline level. 25 yards. No turning back. The torpedo spar was committed now, extending directly toward the ironclad's starboard hull below the waterline. Contact in seconds. Impact. The explosion was beyond anything Glassell had anticipated, a thunderclap that seemed to split the harbor itself. A column of water erupted 40 feet into the air, phosphorescent in the darkness, carrying with it fragments of iron plating and shattered wood. The concussion wave lifted the David bodily out of the water, slamming every man aboard against the hull. The smokestack snapped clean off. Freezing harbor water poured through the opening, flooding the boiler. Steam screamed from ruptured pipes. The engine died. Complete silence except for the ringing in Glassell's ears and water pouring into the crew compartment. They were sinking. "Abandon ship." Glassell's voice sounded distant, muffled. Sullivan was already pulling himself through the hatch. Toombs followed. The water was at their knees, rising fast. Glassell grabbed the confidential papers, ship diagrams, attack plans, anything that couldn't fall into Union hands, and stuffed them inside his jacket before hauling himself topside. The David was listing hard to starboard, her bow already underwater. Union searchlights swept the surface, illuminating the churning foam where the explosion had struck. The 4 men hit the water simultaneously. October in Charleston Harbor, 63 degrees, cold enough to kill in hours. They began swimming away from the stricken vessels, away from the searchlights, toward the distant darkness where Confederate batteries held Fort Sumter. Behind them, the new Ironsides was in chaos. Sailors ran across her deck with damage control equipment. Officers shouted conflicting orders. The blast had torn a hole in her hull 4 feet below the waterline, flooding 2 compartments. She was listing 3 degrees to starboard, taking on water faster than pumps could clear it. For 90 seconds, it looked like she might sink. Then her damage control teams, trained, experienced, professional Navy men who'd fought through 2 years of war, did their jobs. Mattresses stuffed into the breach, emergency pumps activated, counter-flooding to correct the list. The USS New Ironsides stabilized. She didn't sink, but she also didn't return to combat operations. The damage was too severe. She would spend the next 6 months in the Philadelphia Navy Yard undergoing repairs. The Union blockade's most powerful warship had been removed from action by 4 men in a glorified steam kettle. Glassell and Toombs were pulled from the water by Union boats after 30 minutes. Hypothermic, exhausted, but alive. They would spend the rest of the war as prisoners. Sullivan drowned during the swim back. His body never recovered. But James Cannon, the assistant engineer, made it to Fort Sumter. So did the CSS David herself. The torpedo boat hadn't sunk after all. The boiler flooding had stopped when the water reached equilibrium. She'd drifted with the tide, engine dead but hull intact, until Confederate picket boats found her at first light. They towed her back to Charleston, where crews repaired the smokestack and refitted the engine. By November, she was operational again. The David would attempt 2 more attacks before war's end. Neither achieved the success of October 5th, but both forced the Union fleet to implement new defensive procedures, torpedo nets around anchored vessels, steam launches patrolling at night with calcium lights, increased sentry rotations. The invisible ship had made the blockade nervous. More importantly, she'd proven the concept. Theodore Stoney's design spawned 6 more David-class torpedo boats. The Confederate Navy prioritized similar vessels, low-profile, steam-powered, spar torpedo-armed. The technology that nearly sank an ironclad warship in Charleston Harbor would evolve into the submarine warfare that defined naval combat for the next century. The CSS David survived the war intact, one of the few Confederate naval vessels to do so. She was scuttled in Charleston Harbor in February 1865 as Sherman's army approached, buried in mud to prevent capture. Her hull remained there until salvage crews recovered pieces in 1909. Those fragments now rest in museums, 49 feet of riveted iron and pine that changed warfare. What Lieutenant Glassell and his crew accomplished that October night wasn't just a successful attack. It was proof that technology could level an asymmetric battlefield. That innovation could overcome industrial superiority. That 4 men in a vessel barely worthy of the name boat could damage a warship that had survived everything conventional warfare could deliver. Naval doctrine changed because of the David. The era of surface ships invulnerable to smaller vessels ended the moment 134 pounds of black powder detonated against the new Ironside's hull. Every navy in the world took note. Within 2 decades, purpose-built torpedo boats became standard fleet components. By World War I, submarines dominated naval strategy. The line of descent runs clear from Charleston Harbor in 1863 to every submarine, every torpedo boat, every stealthy attack vessel that followed. The CSS David was crude, dangerous, barely controllable. But she worked. She proved what was possible when desperation met engineering, when courage met innovation. On October 5, 1863, under a moonless sky, 4 men in a cigar-shaped boat changed naval warfare forever. Then 3 of them swam for their lives through dark water, while the most powerful ship in the Union fleet took on water and listed toward the harbor bottom. The ironclad survived that night, but the era of the ironclad's dominance did not.